This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 196. Who is handling this virus the best?
Well, whilst COVID-19 isn't particularly good news anywhere in the world, we are starting to see big discrepancies between those countries which have been hit hard and those that seem to have escaped the worst of it. Why is that? And when it's all over, will we find a similar discrepancy between those who bounce back relatively quickly and those economies who suffer the consequences of the current downturn for many years to come? Today, which economy is handling the virus the best? I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Well, in the US, we know that at least 3 million people lost their job in a week a couple of weeks back. So we wait this week for the updated figures, but we know it's going to be a lot more than that. And of course, most of those people will lose their private health cover that came with their jobs just as they need it. In the UK, there are very tame predictions that unemployment will reach 8%, which is double what it was in the 3 months to January. Australia, I suspect, is just at the beginning of the journey, but the economy is pretty much locked down there as well. So layoffs will follow. As productivity decreases, production generally disappears. So just how bad is this going to be? Steve, how bad do you reckon? And is the ensuing unemployment rate the big issue? Because that's, of course, what is going to stop a big bounce back. If people have lost their jobs, they've got to find jobs. That could be a very long and torturous process. So I'd imagine that's a key number, isn't it?
Okay, well, this is actually one of those chicken and egg questions. Which comes first, the supply or demand? And the answer in a monetary economy is the demand comes first. This is Say's law in reverse. Demand creates its own supply fundamentally. Now, if you have something of the order, and it's quite likely to get this high, 30% of the population out of a job, then you're going to rely upon on the remaining 70% of the workforce. So let's say providing additional demand to slowly stimulate those people back into work. It isn't going to work. This is one of those real cases where, you've got an engine and you've got to kickstart it, frankly, and the kickstart is the government, just like the government needs to be the provider of last resort, and when we actually have to shut capitalism down through the lockdowns we're doing to prevent this virus spreading even more rapidly. We need demand to come in and rapidly from the government sector. If it doesn't, we're in for a long and extended depression.
Well, it seems like there's two ways you can do that. One is the way that's being taken in Ireland and Australia and the UK, where they are trying to stop companies laying people off. So if they are proroguing workers, they're basically saying, well, we're going to cover a proportion of your pay on the basis then that those workers will still be employed by you. You can turn the switch, factories or whatever it is you do will start working again. And all is good. That's very different to the approach taken in the United States, isn't it? Where they're basically just saying, well, no, let's do the helicopter money approach. Not enough of it, but let's give money to everybody, put it into their bank accounts. So there's absolutely no incentive for companies to hang on to people, which is why we saw that 3 million increase in a week a couple of weeks back.
Yeah, I mean, you need both. I mean, you've got to provide money to people so that they can pay their fundamental bills. So I actually, as you know, one of our earlier podcasts and earlier post on the side as well, I argued in favour of a modern jubilee, and that really says direct payments to everybody so they can meet all their financial commitments, even though they've lost their employment. But it's also necessary for people not to lose their jobs. You want to say, okay, you're going into. I think it was Jane Carroll who made this analogy. You're going to intensive care. This is not hibernation. The hibernating bear has built up fat before it goes into hibernation, voluntarily goes into hibernation, lives off the fat while sleeping, and comes out trim and ready to eat the next meal. This is not anything like that. This is intensive care. You are putting into an induced coma. We're providing, and you want on the other side of the coma, you want as little damage as possible done to the actual body corporate of the economy, and that means you have to say people keep their jobs. Nobody gets sacked.
Right, and that Ireland, Australia, the UK, and I'm sure there are other countries are trying that approach, aren't they? So I mean, there's perhaps countries didn't respond fast enough, but this came from nowhere, and we clearly weren't prepared. But you'd have to say, for capitalist economies to respond in a way where they're starting to pay people now not to work is a big shift in thinking, and it seems to have happened relatively quickly. So we've got to take some light from that, I guess.
We do, but at the same time, this has repeated the same thing with the financial crisis. I mean, I don't have to explain to you that I was warning about the crisis before it happened. I was haranguing you about it.
Yeah.
Before we started our podcasts. I saw this coming as of December about 2005, if I want to date it correctly. It's 2005, 2006, 2005.
Whenever.
Okay. Now, at the same time, you had people like Ben Bernanke saying everything's absolutely fantastic. The prediction of the Federal Reserve 2008 was going to be a fabulous year. It was all basically telling politicians to sit back and take the credit for a great year, and wham, 2007 August strikes, and we have the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. In that situation, the response of the so-called authority, the people supposedly in charge of the place was, and this is pretty much quoting Hank Paulson, the then US Treasury Secretary, is that we didn't want capitalism to fail on our watch. So these bastards didn't see it coming, but when it hit, holy hell, panic, and they did the exact opposite of everything that their training and then their bias and class interests told them to do beforehand. This is similar.
So how do we be like that hibernating bear then? How do we, in future, how do we have that fat so that we can get through things like this? Is that possible? Is it even possible to do that?
Yes, it is possible, but it's the opposite of what's likely to happen. Again, I mean, thank God the Germans are stupid enough to put their heads up and say something as ridiculous as this before we even get through the crisis. I've forgotten which particular German leader it was. They came out with a statement about a week ago saying that as soon as this is over, we've got to return to austerity. No, you don't. Austerity is a starving bear going into hibernation. Okay, and the whole idea that government should be saving money rather than building resources for a rainy day is nonsense.
Yeah.
It's the resources you need, not the bloody money. They can create that with a flick of a switch, as we're seeing now.
Very easy for Germany to say that, of course, because they haven't got the same death rate that we're seeing in other parts of Europe. But we'll talk in the next podcast, actually, about the future of the EU out of all of this. But Donald Trump is wanting to push ahead with his infrastructure project. So as well as all the money he's pushed forward, which is a sizable proportion of GDP, which is now coming from government funds, he's now also wanting to spend $2 trillion on his infrastructure project, which he's been pushing since he got into power. But he's now saying 0% interest. Now's the time to borrow all this money. New Zealand also want to do that. Shovel-ready projects, they're saying, so people can get into work straight away. So is that sensible? The question to me is...
Yes.
But... who takes up the shovel? Are you ready to take up a shovel, Steve?
Not with my arthritic hands, no.
Well, and that's sort of the point. You've got to have the right people in the right job. So
that's why, for example, sacking 80% of the staff of the pandemic staff of the Centre for Disease Control wasn't the brightest of ideas that he had about a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So this trimming the fat stuff, this is when there's no such thing as a thin bear going into hibernation. A thin bear going into hibernation is a dead bear.
So is there any country you can look at and say they've handled this particularly well?
Yes, in fact, the one that I'm currently in, Thailand, is one that I think can make a fairly strong claim on that front. And also there's, I think Taiwan can make a strong claim. Singapore, a lot of these countries have one thing in common: they experienced SARS and they're Asian.
Yeah,
and this was a major factor. They knew that they had to have, for example, the capacity to produce N95 masks en masse. And just to give you an idea of my daily routine over here in Thailand, it starts with 10 o'clock, going to one of the local bulk food outlets and wearing a mask, standing in a line of a whole lot of other people also wearing masks, and buying 4 masks for the princely sum of 10 baht, which for those who don't speak Thai is 50 US cents. And that'll, by the way, that is a government-mandated price, and it includes a 20% markup profit for the firms making the masks. So it just shows that an orchestrated part private, part government sector response can work dramatically well and slow down the spread of the disease. And that's why the countries that are actually closest to China physically are the ones with the best performance right now.
Right.
Whereas the Europeans, the Americans, total disaster.
But I mean, there's several elements to this, aren't there? One is, yes, okay, you've got to protect yourself and have masks, and obviously we've got the issue in the UK where there's not enough of that basic stuff, even for healthcare workers who really are on the front line. But the other one is this question of isolation, so that you're not seeing the infection spreading. And I'm sort of surmising that in Asia they might have been swifter to respond to that as well by stopping movement between countries and within countries.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, China was one. China. It's great to see when pundits will criticise a particular country, its political system led to this decision, and then do precisely the same bloody thing with a different political system shortly after. So China denied there was any problem. Suppressed the group of doctors who were actually warning about the outbreak of a new form of pneumonia, and did everything they could to pretend it wasn't happening. And then once they realised it was happening, hit the screws in terms of people's capacity to go out into the public in a dramatic way. Now, America, what do? It's going to be all over in 2 weeks, only 15 cases. Yeah. Absolute same garbage, But they didn't do the follow-up that was done by the Chinese, which is a total lockdown. And the lockdown has been dramatically effective.
So the logic to me, and I think this is I think this is now being accepted, isn't it, as the general logic for all of this. Lock down everybody so you stop the infection. Test people so you can see who's got it and be sure that we know that once you've had it, you're immune. And that's the science is still out on that. But if we know that, then those people can gradually get to work. And so we will still need to ensure that we have borders controlled, because we need to, if we're controlling it within our country, we need to make sure people coming into our country are following the same approach as well. You can see that as a logical way out of this. I'm just wondering how many countries are going to follow that approach. I suspect in Asia more so than perhaps in the West.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's partly the sort of state corporate capitalist culture of Asia is coming to its rescue. And like I saw one of my patrons was worried about me, but apparently supporting a totalitarian regime with this particular comment. Hi, Stefanos. What I said, in fact, was that China will use this to legitimize his own rule. Yeah, and do it very successfully. But the combined corporate and status system that exists generally throughout Asia, Marx actually referred to Asia as it being irrigation capitalism and needing a centralized state to control the irrigation. So it goes right back, well before the communist period. That if you're going to have a country running predominantly on irrigation, you needed organisation to link things together, and there was an acceptance of a state having a powerful role. The Chinese Communist Party has probably pushed that far further than applied even under the emperors, but that's why it's successful. People have accepted this culturally for a long, long time.
Well, this difference between cultures is interesting, isn't it? Because in the US there was this denial for a long time. In fact, I think there still is. Reading some shocking articles from the US, but also from Australia as well, where I think there's denial is still rampant about how far this thing can spread, and it's not going to hit us as much as it's hitting anywhere else. In the UK, they needed, so in Asia, yes, there's sort of like a more government down approach where people do what they're told. In the UK, they don't do that, so they needed more enforcement before it worked. In Sweden, we're told they've got a more laissez-faire approach, they say, because people are voluntarily socially distancing, and the incline rate for infections and mobility is much less there than the rest of Europe, although you could argue, well, perhaps they're a little less connected, being stuck off up on that peninsula that we don't go to unless we're going there. So I mean, that might be, their geography might be part of it as well. But it's showing the difference in cultures, isn't it? And those countries that are less willing to be controlled right now are the ones that are suffering the most.
Yeah, I'll go back to China again, because I was very lucky to have had a very early experience of China in November of 1981. I suggested the concept of a seminar between Australian journalists and those of any other country to compare coverage over a year to see how much the issues behind the events are being covered by the respective media. And that was picked up by Jocelyn Shea, who was then the director of the Australia-China Council. And at that time, they were having discussions with the Chinese the Chinese journalists, all China Journalists Association, and they rapidly agreed to the idea of running a seminar between Australian and Chinese journalists. And I ran that seminar in November of 1981. Now, as part of that, we did a tour of China, and before we left the country, there were two pieces of economic data. It's me and 9 Australian journalists who came along, including the son of Manning Clark, Andrew Clark, and a few other fairly prominent Australian journalists. And before we left, we did a caucus of our group of 9, and we were stunned by a piece of data coming out of China saying that light industry production had increased by 17%, and heavy industry had fallen by 8%. And it just did not compute. You need heavy industry to produce light. How the hell did one go up and the other go down so much? We went all through China asking all sorts of questions, including coming back to this one all the time. Every question we ever asked was answered by, we followed the directive of the Central Committee, the Communist Party of China. Absolutely every question. What did you have for breakfast? I followed the directive of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. What that meant was, and I finally worked the logic of this out, was that the Communist Party at that stage was 30 million people out of a country of 1 billion people. So roughly 1 in every 30 people was a member of the Communist Party. You didn't know who it was. So the only way to make sure you're being watched, and the only way to make sure that you didn't get persecuted when things went wrong, as they inevitably would, was to say, I followed the directive of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. Now, what that meant was a slogan would start at the top level of the country and percolate down through the command system down to the region. The slogan might be, for example, and this was a common issue back then, the dominant faction of the Communist Party would be the pro-grain faction. So the slogan would be promote grain. That would get down to the ground level. What would happen? The local communist official would tell the peasants to rip up the legume crops, all the protein stuff, and plant grain. 1 or 2 years later, kids would be born with protein deficiency disease. And I've actually seen this. Yeah. Okay. I saw kids and these weird faces, and I said, this is quackajour. And it was. There would then be a revolt. The peasant would knife the local communist official. They'd go back up the command shaft. The peasants are revolting. It'd flip who's in control. Promote legumes. That would come down. What did they rip up grain? So this is a long period, but punchline is that we asked, why did light industry increase and heavy industry fall? The answer was, well, the Communist Party, CCP, put out a directive to promote light industry. Yes, so what did you do? Quote, unquote, from the guy who has introduced us as the economic boss of Shanghai. We stripped heavy industry factories and turned them into light industry. Now, to bring this forward to what's happened today, Communist Party says isolate people. What happens on the ground level? People go around welding up the doors of apartment blocks. Okay?
And that is the danger, isn't it?
But it's also working. This unfortunately, people starve. People will have died of starvation inside those apartment blocks.
Yeah,
I have no doubt. But the thing is, isolation like a brick. And what has happened is that China's doubling rate has fallen from 2 days to double to 500 days to double.
So 2 questions come out of this. Okay, so that's effective. So I've got 2 questions. One, and these are questions which are sort of commonly being asked now in the media. One is it that bad really? And the second, and are we going too far in terms of how we're enforcing it? So on the common one for is it that bad really? Lots of people die from flu every year. In fact, more than have died from COVID-19 in most countries. But of course, they're ignoring the fact that this is exponential growth, and if you don't stop it,
that's the issue. Yeah.
And but the other one is are we going overboard with this? So an example in the UK is outside London is the epicenter for the UK. And it's far worse than, for example, towns in the north of England where you might actually find there's nobody. So if you'd locked down London earlier, then you might have been able to have less stringent approaches in the rest of the UK where the infection rate is lower or non-existent. So people could, you could almost lock those towns down as well and say, well, okay, everyone can go out and go to work and the economy can perform. So, that's a valid question, isn't it? Have we gone too far by closing down everything, completely stopping the economy?
No, this is one of the areas where, it's the first people who are saying this thing about, it's just like the flu, don't understand the exponential function. And this is the problem. the flu, and this is a great little analogy I saw mentioned by an epidemiologist a couple of days ago, a British one actually, saying that if you have the flu, you are likely to infect, on average, because it's not an average, it's weighting super spreaders with other people. But on average, one person getting the flu will infect 1.3 other people. Now that means that over 10 cycles of getting the flu, the total number of people who've been infected after 10 cycles is 14. If you have coronavirus and we find a statistical average that one person infects 3 other people, after 10 cycles, you will have 59,000 people infected. Now, and the thing is, we know that this thing takes about you can be infected almost immediately. For it to actually show symptoms, it takes between 5 days and 2 weeks.
Yeah.
The doubling period is running about 6 days.
But it does seem to level off, doesn't it? I hear you, and I'm not disagreeing with you. All I'm being is the devil's advocate here, but it does seem to level off. And there's a guy, Charles Einstein. I don't know who he is. He's I don't know if he's related to Einstein. Perhaps he is, but he's got a blog. He points to the Diamond Princess. 3,711 people on board. 20 tested positive for the virus. Half of those had the symptoms. 10 died. And yet here we have a boat where everyone's sharing the same air conditioning system, full of old people. Half of them were aged over 60, and yet out of 3,711, only 10 people died. That's a pretty low morbidity rate, given that everyone was in such a confined space.
10 people died, but it may have the mortality rate is one thing. It's also, if you're looking at some of the cases of people who got this damn thing, you don't want to get it.
Yeah.
It's those the number of deaths, yes, might be, we're talking a death rate of maybe somewhere between 0.3% to 2%. We're not really sure of the range. Okay, so it's not something at that level. 0.3% is a low death rate, but I think it's about 2 or 3 times the death rate from the flu. The trouble is not the death rate itself, it's how fast the death rate grows and how fast you overwhelm all your facilities. And this is the problem. We don't have enough intensive care units for the number of people who will be infected with this at the peak level of infection. So the medical system will break down. The people who get it, though, yes, maybe 0.3% will die. Apparently, something could be as high as 15% get severe symptoms, severe enough to be hospitalized. We can't hospitalize 15% of the population. This is the overwhelming impact of a very rapid rate of growth of disease, even if it has a low level of mortality. And it's still got a higher level of mortality than the flu, even if you're talking 0.3. It's still a lot higher than the flu, I believe. And
the US obviously is going to be hit very hard by this. The UN says their death rate in the US could reach 250,000. In fact, if you look at the number of deaths, they are actually tracking, if you take it from when 50 people died and extract from that day, you'll find that the US is actually increasing the death rate alarmingly faster than Italy did even, and the UK. Oh my God. Even though they can spend big and have spent big to solve the problem. So what's gone wrong there?
Well,
other than having an idiot in charge.
That helps. Dunning-Kruger effect writ large. The medical state of medical health in America in general is appalling. I think this is one thing you can say about this. This is testing the veracity of medical systems all around the planet. And America is failing big time. Yeah. This is the best argument possible for needing universal health care in America. The whole idea that it should be not only private but linked to you being employed, as you said earlier. So you lose your job, you lose access to health insurance, therefore you can't even afford to, you can't even afford to be dragged to the front door of the hospital. They'll throw you out because you can't afford to get inside the entrance. It's totally inadequate for normal situations and catastrophically bad for this situation.
So there's 2 ways we could come out of this, isn't there? One is that, we managed to keep it under control and therefore everybody looks at this and say, look, it wasn't that bad after all, and we just returned to normality. The other way is that we find that it is worse than we thought, and we have more and more government controls as a result of it, and that challenges more our civil liberties. And we find that we can't get them back. So we all become like China at the end of this. Either of those scenarios is not a good scenario.
No, that's right. I mean, the most dangerous one probably is the cry wolf syndrome, where somebody cries wolf and it doesn't really happen. So you think, oh, it's never going to matter, and then the real wolf turns up, and you don't do anything, and you get destroyed. And this is the argument that was put forward by a woman called Laurie Garrett, who was at the time she wrote a journalist. She was the New York Times medical correspondent, and she spent about a decade researching plagues and evolution of new pathogens and so on. And she argued that there are two, and this is based on very sound, very, very, very scholarly research, that there are two main dimensions on which pathogens evolve. One is, of course, transmissibility. The other is how virulent the pathogen is. And normally, in an evolutionary sense, when one particular attribute of an organism or it's hard to call a virus a life form because it's not actually alive. But if it evolves in one direction strongly, so it becomes much more virulent, for example, it's likely to become less transmissible. It sacrifices some genetic capability to go in the opposite direction. Equally, if it becomes more transmissible, then it becomes less virulent. But the odds were always there that one pathogen would evolve in both directions at the one time. You would get more virulent and more transmissible. Now, we're realizing that it certainly isn't as virulent as SARS, for example, let alone Ebola. But it is more transmissible by a large margin than either of those diseases. Not as transmissible as the measles, thank God, which is the average infection rate for the measles is one person will infect 20 others. This looks like being about 3, but it's also got a higher death rate than the normal flu. I think the normal flu's got a death rate of about 0.1%, so 1 in 1,000 will die. This looks about, probably we might be lucky it's 0.3, it could be high as 2%. We really still don't know. But it has got both those characteristics, and the most dangerous is the transmissibility and the fact, of course, you can transmit it without having, without actually having the flu, having symptoms. That is the danger.
But do you think we will get it in check though, and over what time frame?
Well, again, I'm talking outside of my area.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But as a layman, we're all entitled to an opinion. What's your thought?
I think we will get it under control, and probably in the next 6 months. That's a guess.
And in that 6 months, which brings me on to my second point, we will have had so many civil liberties taken away. Are we going to have to fight to get them back again? And the reason I ask that question is because at least the media is covering this, but there's a bit of, what people are calling heavy-handedness by police. They're not actually sort of like tackling people to the ground, but stopping people and asking where they're going. When they're driving to take a form of exercise in a less congested part of the country. You would have thought it's not doing any harm, but they're following by the letter of the law. I guess they've got nothing else to do because there's not many break-ins at the moment because everyone's at home.
And nobody dares break in because they break into the home if somebody's got the disease.
Exactly. Yeah. You can see it's not police state, but you can see how we're heading in that direction.
Well, I think we do have we have an excessive concept of our own liberty on this planet. And that is something which I think does need to be addressed, because the idea that we can, go about and be libertarian in our behaviour would be great if we weren't. If we were the only species on the planet and didn't need the other species to survive and didn't need to worry about some of those species actually being parasites on us. Now we do. And we have pushed the sustainability of this biosphere well past its sustainable level, and we are going to pay the price for it. We humans should never have taken over more than a particular fraction of the planet. They should have left a large part of it for the rest of the species that are alive on this planet, and we haven't done it. As one of my posts, I quoted work by some epidemiologists and mathematical biologists working out that humans constitute roughly 10 times as much of the mass of the mammal species on the planet as other mammals, and our livestock are about 20 times our mass. So we far outweigh if you add up all the elephants, all the lions, all the tigers, all the wallabies, and we're about 10 times their mass, and then our cows are at 20 times our mass. That's ludicrous. We've taken up far too much of the planet. We have to. It can't just be libertarian, democratic.
Well, if this thing we talked about this, we talked about this on the podcast last week, didn't we? I mean, So if this is worse than we thought, maybe but this is part of nature's correction. Let's hope it's not quite so drastic. Just on the final point, we're seeing big spending, obviously, to try and tackle all of this. People who don't believe in modern monetary theory, who don't think that governments through their central banks can create money, are saying this is going to take a long time to pay back, and economies we're going to be paying for this longer than we did for the global financial crisis. Do you think that will be the case, or I mean, Donald Trump is spending like it's going out of fashion. He has no intention of paying any of this money back. I mean, he paid for he had his tax cuts, then he's had his first tranche of his rescue package for the virus. Now he wants a $2 trillion infrastructure project. He has no intention of paying that back. It's not going to hurt the U.S. economy, is it? But other countries, you mentioned Germany and Europe, it sounds like they are.
They don't need to. This is the other crazy thing about it. This whole worry about how are we going to pay for it? You print the bloody money. Yeah, you and I know that, and regular listeners to this podcast know that. So I guess the question is, will everybody else start to realize that now? Will people be looking and saying, well, how come Donald Trump's not paying any of this money back? How come his debt just keeps on increasing? How come Japan has over 200% of government debt to GDP ratio, and and they're still functioning? Yeah, I don't know that it's actually going to give the same insights for everybody else, but it should be enough of it'd be a bit of a wake-up call. I mean, people's capacity not to learn from things like this is still something I'm getting used to, realizing how little people learn from experience, unfortunately. But yes, it's going to be something that the advocates of modern monetary theory can point to and say, look, you got that totally wrong. There was no need to repay it. We could produce the money as rapidly as we wanted to, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are going to become more obvious than they were beforehand. But people's capacity to hang on to an ideology, despite it being proven wrong, is still something that I don't underestimate, unfortunately.
I can hear the disappointment in your voice.
Yeah, it's real. It's real.
But, if you want a big example, this is a huge example. I mean, So, I mean, it's hard to argue against the facts. All right, we'll leave it there. Next time, let's look at how the EU has stuffed all this up, and whether it actually could be the end of the EU, certainly the end of the euro. I think it could be. I'm sure you do too, but we'll talk about that next week.
I do.
Good talk, Steve.
Hey, mate.
Actually, we might squeeze in another one before we do that one on the EU, because we've got one that's been sitting on the shelf for a while, which we still haven't played, which is one recorded a while ago, looking at the work of Adam Smith, the early work of Adam Smith. Is there anything in there, anything at all, which we could take out and say applies to a modern-day economy? We'll look at that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.